Hello, this is Lafayette Faust, creator of the Nevermore Hollows podcast. Thank you for making the show a success. Please take a moment to subscribe, give 5 stars, comment, and share the show with your friends. It's the best way to help us grow and to be able to continue to provide quality horror content. Also, please support our new art director, Chris Madman Goins at Black Sheep Studios TN on Instagram. He has some amazing Nevermore Hollows art for sale, signed by the both of us, as well as many other original pieces I think you're going to love. Now, for you horror hounds who like to have a good laugh, I invite you to check out my other podcast. It's called The 3 Uncool Cats. In it, my 2 friends and I sit in a basement and discuss music, movies, and whatever else comes into our warped minds. I would really appreciate it if you would give it a listen. Now, with that out of the way, I invite you to sit back, turn on a light, and prepare yourself. Twilight outlined the landscape in purple shadows. A full moon rose above the towering treetops of Dunwich Forest and looked down upon the Pink Flamingos trailer park. At the park's entrance, the old mid-century modern sign winked awake in teal and pink neon. Some of the letters on the sign burned brighter than the others, spelling out, "In Flames Trailer Park." It was located 5 miles outside the town limits of Nevermore Hollows, and was a place where strange things happened so often that the residents accepted them as part of their daily lives. Chupacabras had been known to carry off beloved pets. People 10 days dead had been seen wandering the lanes at night, and on any given day the number of trailers could be either 100 or 101, as some occasionally popped into and out of existence. Rory Boudreau and Stevie Muse were both 12 years old and had been best friends ever since Rory moved into the trailer across from Stevie's 10 months ago. During that time, they had been kidnapped by a man who had carved his face to look like a jack-o'-lantern, fought the ghost of a serial killer, and had become the mortal enemies of a demon-possessed monkey who called himself Psycho Juju. Stevie was light-skinned with red hair and freckles and had lived in Nevermore his whole life. Rory had dark hair and dusky skin that highlighted his heritage of black and Cajun, and had lived in New Orleans before moving into the park. They rode their dusty bikes across the trailer park, and between them padded a dog that seemed to be a mix of husky and border collie. It was lean with spotted gray and white fur, and one eye was blue and the other green. The dog had shown up a month ago and had instantly befriended them. It followed them everywhere they went, and always seemed to be smiling in that all is right with the world attitude that makes dogs so endearing. It would sit between the boys whenever they read their comic books, looking back and forth at the pages as if sharing the joy of reading. The boys had quickly fallen in love with the pooch and had taken nearly 3 full days to agree upon a name that they felt best suited him. They had settled on Macready, after the character in John Carpenter's remake of The Thing. "So, who done told you that they was pixies in the woods here?" Rory asked in his Cajun patois. "Miss Whimsey told me," Stevie replied as they shot through the stop sign at the end of Apollo Lane and turned onto Mercury. "What?" Rory replied. "When did you talk to her?" Stevie's face blushed. Molly Whimsey was 20, pretty, kept her blonde hair in a ponytail, and had sad blue eyes. She seemed anxious and glanced around often as if she expected to be jumped. She had moved into trailer number 19 a week ago, and Stevie had developed a crush on her. She was washing her truck, Stevie said. I asked her if she needed help, and we kind of talked. She asked me if I ever saw lights in the woods at night, and I told her I didn't. And she said these lights could be colorful, Rory said as he swerved to avoid a pothole. Like a string of Christmas lights, Stevie replied. Rory gave this information some thought. We be out at night all the time, and we seen some crazy stuff, but we ain't never seen any lights like that in the woods. Stevie shrugged. Maybe it's something new. Gotta be, Rory said. The dynamic between the boys was such that Rory was the rash one who got them into trouble, and Stevie was the thinker who got them out. She said she seen them at the edge of the woods? Yep, Stevie replied. Said she sees them at night when she's out taking a walk. I see where you're going with this, Rory. You know Mr. Ivanovich has told us to stay out of the woods, especially at night. Ivan Ivanovich was the park's live-in custodian. He was fit and looked to be 50, but the boys felt that he was a lot older. He wore his hair cut short in a military buzz and was a man of few words. The boys were both fatherless. Stevie's had left just after he was born, and Rory's had been killed back in New Orleans by a voodoo queen, and they had come to see Ivan as a father figure. He did, Rory replied. We aren't going into the woods, especially at night, Stevie cautioned. We ain't, Rory replied. That would be insane, Stevie said. Rory nodded. It would. They rode along in silence for a block, McCready loping effortlessly along between them. It was now full-on dark. Many of the residents had strung up clear and multicolored lights on their lots to make the park look more joyful. They reminded Stevie of what Molly had told him. Miss Whimsey called them pixie lights, Stevie said. I looked them up on the internet but couldn't find anything about them looking like Christmas lights. Most pixie lights are orange or white. Well, nothing in Nevermore is normal, Rory said. They pulled to a stop at the end of Mercury. McCready wandered over to say hi to a squirrel. One of the things that made the boys so amazed at McCready was that other animals were not afraid of him. Neither squirrels, nor rabbits, nor birds ran from him. It was as if the other animals intuited that McCready meant no harm. I think she's hiding from somebody, Stevie said. Rory gave Stevie a thoughtful look. What make you think that? Well, she gets no mail, Stevie said, so it doesn't seem anybody knows she lives here. And I saw that she had a pistol in a holster hidden under her shirt, and she walks around the park every night, but I don't think it's for exercise. It's like she's on patrol, and she always seems nervous. Well, that don't surprise me none, Rory replied. Just about everybody in this place be hiding from somebody. They turned down a dark lane that ended in a small cul-de-sac with 3 vacant trailers. They were in the far reaches of the park. The only light was moonglow. They jumped off their bikes and walked between 2 of the trailers and stood, with McCready between them, about 20 yards from the edge of the forest. Dunwich Forest was filled with ancient oaks, towering sycamores, and swaying pines. It was dark even in the brightest of days, and as the boys stood facing it, it seemed as if they looked off the edge of the earth into a starless void. They were silent for 5 minutes, which is an eternity for 12-year-old boys and curious dogs. But they knew that their silence would encourage the pixies to appear, if they did in fact inhabit the dark woods. Suddenly, a few yards behind the tree line, there was a tiny flash of neon violet light. A few seconds later, another. This time neon amber. 3 more in blue, red, and green. There was a heartbeat where they stopped. Then, more than a dozen of them began to lackadaisically swirl around each other, sleepily blinking like Christmas-colored fireflies. The boys stood in wide-eyed wonder, mouths open in pleasant surprise. "That's way cool," Stevie whispered. "Wonder why we ain't never seen this before," Rory replied. Without taking his eyes off the neon pixie dance, Stevie shrugged. "Who knows? But usually when something new and strange happens here, it ain't good." There was movement behind them. They turned to see Molly Whimsey quietly walking toward them. Stevie was able to hide his surprise from her, but not from Rory. She stopped between them and watched the pixie dance. But her quiet energy did not express wonder. Instead, it expressed worry. Though young, the boys had gotten adept at reading body language. "Miss Whimsey, what's wrong?" Stevie asked. "Call me Molly," she replied, glancing up at the full moon. "You boys shouldn't be out tonight." "We out every night," Rory said. "We can take care of ourselves pretty good." Molly looked at Rory, sizing him up. She seemed to decide to accept his claim, then looked back at the dancing lights and nervously nibbled her lower lip. "Stevie says you call them pixie lights," Rory said. Molly nodded. "That's what they are. You boys have never seen them before?" Both boys shook their heads. "What can you tell us about them?" Stevie asked. Molly glanced around them. It appeared she was growing more concerned. "They are rare. They usually live in wooded and rural areas, and they look pretty but can be very dangerous. But typically they won't bother you if you don't bother them." "They seem to be worrying you a good bit," Rory said. Molly shot him an appreciative glance. "You're pretty good at reading people for such a young man. And yes, it does worry me." "Why?" Stevie asked. "Because of the Dogman," Molly said. "What's that?" Stevie asked. Molly turned in a slow circle, taking in her surroundings, though it was too dark to see much detail. It was clear she was becoming more anxious. "A creature that is half man, half dog," she said. "Not to be confused with a werewolf. Dogmen don't change from man to beast, and they don't go crazy at a full moon either. And they are intelligent, and they're relentless." "Well, nobody ever seen any Dogman in Nevermore," Rory said. Molly nodded at the pixies as they swirled and twirled. "You will now." There was a long moment where they all watched the mesmerizing pixie dance. Stevie was disappointed to know that something that looked so elegant and peaceful was such a harbinger of bad news. "What do you mean by that?" he said. "Pixies and dogmen have been mortal enemies for thousands of years," Molly said. "If you see one, the other is likely to show up eventually." "You think there's a Dogman here?" Stevie said, glancing around, now on alert. Before Molly could reply, the pixies began to move in a more agitated manner, and instead of the multicolored flashes, they all turned an angry, glowing red. "Oh shit," Molly said. The crimson pixie glow became so urgently bright that it lit up a 15-yard section of the forest, exposing a beast standing over 6 feet tall. It had thick shoulders, powerful biceps, and rippling leg muscles. It was covered in short fur, and its head resembled that of a pit bull. Its lips were pulled back into a snarl, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth. It must have been trying to creep up on the pixies as they danced. "Is that the Dogman?" Stevie whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. "Yes," Molly whispered. "Quietly, carefully, follow me. We have to get out of here now." The three of them began to slowly back away, intending to put one of the trailers between them and the Dogman so that it wouldn't see them. But after only taking a couple steps, the Dogman stuck his nose in the air and sniffed. Then it turned its black eyes on them. "Crap!" Molly hissed. "Run, boys!" The boys ran toward their bikes. Molly grabbed her Smith & Wesson from the holster under her shirt. McCready ran a few yards forward and gave a warning growl. Rory and Stevie pedaled into the lane and glanced over their shoulders. "McCready, come on!" Stevie yelled. But McCready stood his ground. The Dogman shot away from the pixies and out of the forest toward McCready. McCready snarled and jumped at the Dogman, but the Dogman swiped at him with powerful hands that ended with sharp claws. McCready let out a bark of pain and hit the ground hard. The Dogman then loped toward Molly. "Boys, go!" she yelled. "I'll hold him off." She took aim and squeezed off 2 shots. One was wide and missed. The other shot hit the Dogman in the shoulder. He didn't even flinch. He just plowed on toward her. She fired again, grazing the Dogman's thigh. She caught movement from the corner of her eye. A dirty, wild-eyed man stepped out of the abandoned trailer to her left. He looked homeless and was likely using the abandoned trailer as shelter. "Get back in the trailer!" she yelled at the man. The wild man gave her a confused look, not realizing that the Dogman was running up behind him. The Dogman slammed into him. They hit the ground in a rolling heap, the Dogman snarling and the poor guy screaming. Molly fought back the urge to vomit when the beast buried its snout into the man's throat. Blood sprayed as an artery was severed, and the Dogman gave itself over to its bloodlust and began savaging the man. Molly turned and ran as fast as she could after the boys. She was about 20 yards behind them, hoping to escape while the Dogman mauled the homeless guy. But her heart sank when both the boys turned their bikes off the lane and shot around one of the abandoned trailers. They were clearly doubling back, as if trying to get behind the Dogman. "Boys," she yelled, "what are you doing?" Without looking back, Stevie said, "We're going after McCready." "No," she yelled, "it's too dangerous." She lost sight of them, but she heard Rory say, "We ain't leaving him. He's our dog." "Damn it," Molly hissed. "You boys are going to get yourselves killed." Molly shot around the back of the trailer and saw that the boys had jumped off their bikes and were now knelt over McCready, who was standing, though clearly his right foreleg was broken. She also saw that the pixies had moved out of the blackness of the forest. They were hovering in their crimson glow 10 feet away from the boys and the dog. Molly didn't know if the pixies were a threat or not, so she kept her eye on them as she ran to help the boys. It occurred to her that she had no idea how to fight them if they were. The homeless man's screams were trailing off into a wet gargle. Molly's mind raced for a way out of this deadly situation. How was she going to be able to save these boys when they wouldn't leave their injured dog? She made it to them and saw that McCready was worse than just a broken leg. There was a terrible gash on his left side that was so deep she could see bone. The boys were clearly worried, but were keeping their composure. McCready looked up at her, his eyes full of pain, but he did not whimper. Molly shook her head. "Oh, dear. Boys, I'm so sorry that he's hurt, but we have to go now." "He tried to protect us," Stevie said. "We will protect him too." Molly shot a glance at the crimson-colored pixies. They had moved to within 5 feet. The homeless man had gone quiet. The Dogman would be after them any second. She looked toward the abandoned trailer closest to them. There was a back door. "Come on," she said, and she ran up the steps and tried the doorknob. Thankfully, it was unlocked. "Hurry, bring him in here." "We be real sorry about this, McCready," Rory said. Then, together, he and Stevie picked the dog up and carried him up the steps and into the trailer. Molly slammed the door behind them and locked it. The door was flimsy, not likely to hold an onslaught from a massive Dogman, but it bought them a few seconds to think. She looked around the trailer, which was furnished in decrepit furniture that looked to be relics from the 1970s. "Look and see if there's anything you boys can use as weapons." She knew she still had most of a clip of ammo and wished that she had brought a spare magazine. She glanced at McCready, who was bleeding badly with thick droplets splattering the floor. She knew he wasn't going to make it, and her heart broke for the boys because it was clear how much they loved him. She cried out in surprise when the Dogman slammed against the door. It snarled and pressed its snout against a small window, smearing gore against the glass. Then it reared back its head and slammed it against the glass, shattering it. It stuck its snout through the opening and snapped at her. Strings of bloody drool dripped from its maw of thick fangs. She aimed and fired a shot between its eyes. The Dogman's head snapped back, and it gave a raging howl. She could see through the window that the bullet had left a nasty gash, but had not penetrated its skull. She had heard of such incidents with smaller caliber guns and certain animals with thick skulls. She was furious with herself for only carrying her 9mm instead of something more powerful. The Dogman hammered the door with his massive fists, leaving bulging dents. The door wasn't going to hold much longer. Though McCready was in terrible pain and shaking from trauma, he hobbled forward and gave a threatening bark at the Dogman. Stevie stepped beside him, holding a baseball bat that the last tenant had left behind. Rory had found a medium-sized steak knife. The Dogman stopped his assault at the door. In a thick, guttural voice, it spoke.
"Woman, let me have the boys."
Molly had lived most of her life afraid, but now she was in the throes of sheer terror. "No, that's not going to happen," she replied. The Dogman slammed his fist against the door. The cheap metal of the doorframe warped. It wouldn't withstand much more of the assault.
"I smell their innocence."
There was a hungry edge to his voice.
"I need to taste it."
Molly wanted to fire every damn shot she had through the door in the hopes of killing the beast. But somehow she knew that bullets were not enough. It might slow him down, but it wouldn't kill him. Her mind raced on what to do. Before she could decide, the Dogman turned and jumped off the steps. He then ran around the trailer, headed for the front door. "Boys, make sure that door is locked. Push that recliner in front of it." The boys jumped into action, but as they grabbed the worn-out recliner, the living room windows smashed open in a spray of glass as the Dogman hurled himself through. He landed on all fours in the center of the room. Stevie was the closest. He brought the bat down onto the Dogman's head with a meaty thud, causing the beast to growl in pain and rage. He turned and snapped at Stevie. Rory saw his chance. He stepped forward and brought the steak knife down onto the Dogman's back, just under his right shoulder blade. The dogman barked in pain and jerked around and snatched Rory's arm and pulled him close. Rory used his free hand to punch him in the eye. Then, in a flash of fur, McCready hurled through the air and chomped down on the dogman's arm. The dogman let go of Rory so that he could deal with McCready. Rory stumbled back and fell to the floor. Then, the dogman grabbed McCready by his neck, lifted him up, and ripped out his throat. Rory and Stevie both yelled out in shock. Molly now had a clear shot. She fired her gun 3 times, hitting the dogman on the cheek, neck, and chest. He stumbled back, but only for a second, then regained his footing, a massive, blood-covered horror. He lowered his head at Molly and charged. That's when the pixies swarmed in through the broken front window. There were now 24 of them. They were glowing that fierce neon red, and there was an angry buzzing coming from them, sounding like a swarm of hornets. They attacked the dogman. About half of them seemed to be stinging him in the eyes, his throat, his stomach. The other half swirled around him and began sprinkling him with a fine red mist. The dogman howled in agony and swatted at the pixies. His fur began to sizzle. Molly and the boys could smell his burnt flesh. Then they saw that his skin beneath the fur began to dissolve, as if the red mist was acid. The pixies swarmed and buzzed and stung and sprinkled. The dogman began to lose strength as he swatted at them. He smashed through the front door and fell in the yard. The flesh on his left arm and most of his back was already burned away, exposing white bone. He pushed himself up and began to run around the side of the trailer, headed for the forest. He opened his mouth to rage at the pixies, but the pixies swarmed into his mouth, down his throat. He choked, and his throat bulged. Within seconds, all 24 or so of the pixies had entered the dogman's body through his snout. Then, with a thick, wet pop, the dogman exploded in a bloody mist. There was nothing left, but where he was standing was the swarm of pixies. They pulsed in victorious blue. After a moment, they began to blink in their original Christmas-like colors. They fanned out and zipped back to the trailer where they hovered over McCready's torn body. Molly glanced at the boys. Both had eyes glistening with unshed tears. They were staying strong, stoic. "What are they doing?" Stevie said. "Looks like they be thinking about something," Rory replied. The pixies began to flash in unison. They turned violet and started sprinkling McCready in a mist of the same color. It was so thick that for a heartbeat they could only see the dim outline of McCready's body. Suddenly, the pixies swarmed up from the dog, swirled around in a happy dance, then out the broken window into the night. McCready twitched and gave a whimper. The boys ran over to him. "Boys, be careful," Molly said. She was afraid that McCready wouldn't be himself. However, she was pleasantly surprised when McCready pushed himself up and began happily licking the boys' faces. "He's alive," Stevie said. Rory laughed as he stroked McCready's back. "Dem pixies done healed him. He ain't hurt no more. He ain't got a scratch on him." Molly knelt beside McCready, saw that his leg was no longer broken. The gash in his side was gone. She looked into his eyes, searching for something malignant, but only saw the sweet innocence of McCready's soul. She patted him, told him he was a good boy for protecting them. Then she stood and headed out the back door. "Where are you going?" Stevie asked. "I need to deal with the homeless man's body," Molly replied. "Ain't you going to call the sheriff?" Rory said. He and Stevie and McCready followed Molly out into the dark backyard. Molly turned toward them. I'm afraid to call the sheriff because there will be questions about my past that I don't want to answer. Stevie shook his head. You don't have to worry about that, Molly. We know the sheriff. He'll understand. Molly didn't look convinced. Maybe so, but I'd rather not take the chance. I need to get rid of the body, the homeless guy, and I don't want you boys to get involved with that. Rory thoughtfully scratched his chin and looked at Molly. How did you know about these pixies and dogmen? Molly couldn't look at him as she spoke. It's embarrassing. I was stupid and naive, and I got mixed up with a guy. He said he was a warlock, and I never really believed in that kind of stuff, but he showed me that magic and the paranormal is real, and that's where I learned about pixies and dogmen. McCready chuffed and ran around the corner of the trailer. He paused briefly to look back to see if they were following. When they weren't, he gave a short bark that seemed to say, Come on already. The boys ran after him without hesitation. Molly kept her gun at her side but followed. They rounded the corner to see that the pixies were sprinkling their red pixie dust onto the homeless man's body. Within only a few minutes, the body was completely dissolved, leaving only a burnt patch of grass. Even the gore was dissolved. Then, when their work was done, the pixies began flashing their very cheery neon Christmas colors, swirled around Molly and McCready and the boys, then floated back into the woods. That was gross, Stevie said. Yeah, but kind of cool, Rory said. Boys, does this kind of thing happen often here? The boys exchanged a glance where there was unspoken communication. Then Rory said, It don't happen every day? Then Stevie added, But it does happen every night. The boys laughed in a way that only boys do when they share a lame inside joke. Molly wanted to know more about these boys in this strange trailer park. How about I treat you boys to a trip to Pennywise Ice Cream Parlor and you tell me everything you know about this place? The boys' eyes lit up. Heck yeah, Rory said. But only if McCready can come, Stevie said. McCready's tongue lolled happily out of his mouth as he looked expectantly at Molly. Deal, she said. They went back to her trailer, where they washed the blood from McCready's fur and freshened themselves up. Then, they headed to the ice cream parlor where Rory and Stevie regaled her with their adventures over the past year. As she listened, she was amazed at their resilience. She was also surprised at her own courage. She had a long way to go, but tonight had shown her that she did not need to live in fear. Her life was different now, and she knew it would never be the same. And she was good with that.